I am showing 2 minutes after the hour, so let's officially kick this off. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeffrey Moss, the founder and CEO of Parker Dewey, and I want to welcome you to our fourth State of Campus Recruiting call. If you haven't joined us for these in the past, I used to refer to these sessions as not a podcast because it's not, but it's also not a webinar. There won't be slides or a presentation. Instead, what we're doing is just going to sit down and talk with leaders in the campus recruiting space about what's working and what's not. And I got to tell you, I'm really, really fired up about today's conversation. I've had the pleasure of getting to know Jameel Rush over the past, year or so. He's the AVP and Chief Diversity Officer at Aramark. And I think he has a lot of hope about positive change coming out of this current situation. We've had the opportunity to get to know each other through some of the great work of the University Innovation Alliance. And again, given what we're all going through, both as a society, but also tied to this global pandemic, I'm really excited to get his perspective. So we have some topics we're going to discuss. We saw a lot of questions come in from folks who signed up for the webinar. We'll try to cover those. But to the extent you have questions or comments along the way, we encourage you to use the Q&A feature, the chat feature. My colleague Michelle is on the line also, and will try to help us get through those either real time or in the discussion. So with that, let me really turn it over to Jameel to tell us a little bit more about his background and what you're doing now at Aramark.
Yeah. Hey, Jeff. Thanks for having me on too. Really excited to be here and talk to your audience, and obviously to talk to you and see your smiling face during this session here. Again, as Jeff said, my name is Jameel Rush. I've been with Aramark since actually 2007, so I've been with the organization for a number of years. Had a very small hiatus with a different organization in there for about 3.5 years, but the better part of my career I've been here with Aramark and working across a bunch of human resources functions. So everything from HR business partner roles to leadership development, organizational development, but most recently stepped into this role leading the diversity and inclusion frontman department with Aramark, as well as our early talent programs, which means that I focus on what do we do to recruit diverse talent into our organization? How are we building a culture that values inclusion across our workforce? And then what are we doing to make sure that we make an impact in our local communities? I also have a part of my job that manages our campus hire program. So we bring in a number of campus hires each year, both full-time hires as well as interns through our Accelerate to Leadership program, as well as our Step Up to Leadership program. So I'll caveat all of this with, I don't consider myself a campus recruiting professional. I get to work really closely with our campus recruiting team and get to manage a lot of the experience for our candidates once they come through the door for us. So I play in this space a lot, but I don't want to take the real shine from our great campus recruiting team, who they're really the legs on the ground.
No, and that's important, because I think one of the things I want to make sure we get to is how diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives can exist in the vacuum, and how they need to tie closely with campus recruiting. And that's actually probably a great segue. Like, what was your process like when you were in college and looking for that first job?
Yeah. Jeff, you're taking me back, man, all the way back.
I'm older than you. Look at you have hair. I'm bald.
It's all shading.
And you're not even gray.
You just can't see the gray. It's all about angles, Jeff. That's it's interesting. And so I graduated back in 2007, Temple University up here in Philadelphia. So go TU. And I remember my internship search as well as my full-time job search. And I remember like going to all of the job boards and applying to every single I was an HR major, every single human resources major that there was, and finding very little luck with that. And my job search didn't really kick off, or take off, I should say, until I got active in student programs on campus. So I got heavily involved with the Society for Human Resource Management, which I know you know a lot about, Jeff, at the undergrad level. So Temple had a student professional organization, a local chapter of that SHRM org, got involved there, sort of volunteered to take on officer roles. And that allowed me to connect with HR professionals who were working in the field already. And it was through those connections that I started to get access to all of the internships that I had through undergrad. And it actually was through that connection as well that I got to connect in with the Aramark campus recruiting team at the same time. So before I had ever gone into an interview, before I even walked into a job fair, I met them on campus when they were talking about what it means to work in HR at Aramark, doing one of those informational sessions. So when I got to the job fair, I already knew them. And then when I got to the interview process, I had already learned a lot about the company and the roles, and I was able to prepare differently. So, the job search it's tough, but it's really through that networking and those connections on campus that helped to give me a bit of an advantage.
And what drove you to HR in particular?
Yeah, like every 13-year-old kid in high school, you grow up and say, I want to be a human resources manager, right? Like that's, is that not the American dream? No, I came in as a business management major, undecided. So the way Temple's curriculum works is when you major in business, you have to take every functional area of business. So I had to take classes in finance, accounting, marketing, risk management, supply chain, and I was taking all these courses and none of them really appealed to me, honestly, until I got to this HR. It's an organizational development class that they make you take. And it was the first time that I even learned about this idea of an organization or a company maximizing its human resource, right? Like that's where human resources come from. It's about optimizing the human or the people aspect of your company. And that really stood out to me, and going into a field that would allow me to say, what are we doing to train, retain, maximize productivity, create good culture, all those pieces associated with talent development that I thought I would really want to do long term. So I didn't choose that as a major until I was probably about in my sophomore, junior year, once I'd actually learned what it was. And then here I am today.
Yeah, but that's important because again, it ties back to the importance of career exploration. And there's so much discussion about kids going to college and sort of from day one freshman year pursuing a very specific path without having that opportunity to explore. I guess with Aramark in particular, you made this decision sophomore year that you wanted to pursue HR. I mean, was Aramark top of the list, the first one you thought about, or did it really come up through call it the accidental interaction at the SHRM events or the like?
Yeah, accidental. So I didn't learn my first.
And not negative accidental, by the way.
Absolutely, yeah. Because exploration's so key. And had I not been able to explore different career paths, who knows what would have happened, right? And I think when I was in high school that I wanted to be a doctor or something like that, which would have been a terrible, terrible decision for me and all of
And
my
for your
future
patients.
Exactly. So that exploration was so key for me. And my first, or I would say my second internship inside of HR was for a large pharmaceutical company, and Aramark was actually the food service provider there. So my first time ever even learning about the company wasn't until I was two internships deep, and going into my senior year. So it was the summer after my junior, going into my senior year. So that's when I learned about the organization for the first time. And it wasn't until that fall that I learned that they had an HR development program at the time. So these are things that the stars kind of aligned for me to find the right spaces for me to go into. And it was through those I had a friend of mine who was in the professional organization I was dealing with. She had interned with Aramark. She brought them to campus to talk to us. So it was sort of these really series of fortunate events that stood up to help me get access to the opportunity.
But that's interesting, again, especially as we think about this year. I mean, I joke around about the amount of money companies spend on chicken skewers and other things to convince students to show up to info sessions. And by the way, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Even if a student's coming for the food, they're still learning about a company, and it provides that opportunity for those accidental interactions and exploration. As we think about this fall, where whether or not students are back on campus, employers probably won't be because of travel restrictions or other limitations about just being in close spaces with large numbers of other people. I mean, do you worry about that this fall, not having those opportunities?
Yeah, it's going to be very different for us on campus, right? Both in terms of where we go, how we engage with students and potential candidates. Also think about a lot of the internship programs that were scheduled to happen this summer were either canceled or look very different. Those internship programs are really critical feeder pools into those full-time hire opportunities, especially for large employers like us. And the way that you create a presence on campus is you're there consistently, right? So you don't just show up at the job fair and hope that everyone comes to your booth. You build those relationships on campus. So even building the relationships will look different for us this coming fall. It's going to be a bit of an uncharted territory on both sides of the table. So both for the employers in the college campuses, and not to mention the students who are working through this as well. So there's going to be some things that are going to work really well, I imagine, and some things that'll be hit or miss while we just figure this out together.
You hit on a couple of things. Again, the internships being a feeder was one of the things you hit on. What are some of the other big concerns about this fall? And I recognize, again, you're not leading campus recruiting, but you're obviously part of that process. I mean, what's keeping you up at night, or what are you hearing within Aramark that's keeping them up at night?
Yeah, I think there's a few different things. So one is companies are still trying to figure out what the future of COVID looks like. So I'll think like demand planning happens now. Most organizations look for the majority of their full-time talent in the fall and then kind of supplement that in the spring. We don't know what next year is going to look like for us. It's hopeful that there's some sort of vaccine or mass sort of herd immunity, what all those things that we talk about. But the reality is that the curve is still happening for us in the States. So that impacts our way to accurately predict the number of hires that we would even bring in from a campus standpoint. So we'll be behind the eight ball collectively, not just Aramark, but I think most organizations are going to not necessarily just be behind the eight ball. They're going to kind of be throwing darts a little bit blindly of saying like, hey, this is what we typically need. This is what we think we're going to need, but asterisks next to all of it, like COVID-19, right? All that could change any of it. So that'll hurt the way we go through. The other piece is campuses are still trying to figure out what they're going to do in the fall. And as we're making our plans around where can we travel, where can we not travel, how will we engage with students, some campuses will be open, some won't be open, some are still deciding right now whether or not they're going to be open. So that's going to be a challenge, and whether or not they're open the entirety of the semester will be different. We're hearing all types of things around what that looks like. Some are saying, hey, we'll open August through November, and then I sort of send people home from there before we get back into deep flu season. So there's just a lot of things really up in the air where this process tends to be very systematic for employers. Demand planning, strategy around which campuses we're going to, how we're going to engage with those campuses, and then how are we going to select talent. All of those things have question marks next to them this go around.
Yeah, and again, your point is there's so many unknowns, and you don't want to be caught sort of in September or October saying, oh crap, what are we going to do?
Right.
But you also can't predict. But you also said something really, really interesting in there where you talked sort of at the end where you talked about what campuses you're going to be going to. Mm-hmm. And I was on a call yesterday or webinar yesterday with some other campus recruiting leaders, and we started to talk a little bit about the silver linings. And are there silver linings coming out of this global pandemic? And not to minimize it by any stretch, but is this creating opportunities that may not have existed before? So when you talk about going to campus, if Aramark physically can't be on campus, along with every other recruiter where you just can't physically be on campus, does this potentially start to break down some of those geographic limitations? Can you start to get to know students from campuses that may have been too small to be, quote unquote, worth your time to visit? Or get to know students at campuses that weren't in your focus schools? Is that something you're thinking about, and or are there other silver linings?
Yeah, and I think the virtual engagement is going to be really interesting too, Jeff, of now more students will get to access the programmatic content, right? So jobs are always there. You could always go and apply to jobs virtually and those things, but you and I know that the personal connection piece is still really critical in this job search process. So now as we're doing, whether that's an Aramark informational session, or I think a lot of organizations are starting to pivot to professional development targeted towards students, while those things are happening, it creates more access to others who would like to stand up and say like, I would have never heard from you last year because there's no way that you would have come to my couple thousand student college campus or something, or there's just geographically really difficult to get
Yeah.
there to some of our college towns. Um, Now I can just boot up, right, and be a part of that conversation and learn about so many more things. So I think it 100% will give the opportunity for access to others who have not had it before. And especially as you think about my work and my thoughts around equity, that access is critical to making sure that we can reach all populations.
Well, and building upon that, I think about the student from the fancy background who's always interacted with professional adults,
Mhm.
whether it's through their parents or just parties or events they're at, versus those students who are first generation or came from different backgrounds, where they show up to one of the info sessions and they're not necessarily as comfortable interacting with an intimidating professional like you, and they don't necessarily carry themselves the same way or have. Does this start to level the playing field so that that first filter is not how well can you as a student work a room, um, but potentially something else?
It's a good question. And I don't know if I have a direct answer for you. I think in general, it won't happen unless we're intentional about it, right? I think there
Yeah.
are barriers to exposure that will get reinforced through the lack of interpersonal engagement, right? So now it's even harder for me to talk to you and learn more about it and stand out from the pack. And that exposure piece tends to be just a barrier in general for diverse communities. So if you're not intentional about it, and if we're not intentional about it as an employer, those things can get reinforced. Or if we are intentional about it, we can say like, all right, how are we getting access to diverse communities? How do we make sure that we present content that's going to be relevant to diverse communities? How do we make sure the way that we talk about our roles and our jobs are not things that are like male-centric terminology? So all that stuff you need to still be really intentional about as an employer, because it's not like we'll go virtual and now everyone gets the chance, the opportunities. There's still systemic things at play
Oh,
that you need to work through.
without a doubt,
Mhm.
without a doubt. And I'm just wondering if again, if it's no longer limited by, I guess, a hiring manager's preconceived notions of what the
Mhm.
right candidate looks like.
Yeah.
And looks like could mean physically, but it also could mean looks like from a school, or looks like what kind of suit or outfit.
Yeah.
Does that create a way, and you still have to be intentional about it, but does it at least create a catalyst to start to break down some of those barriers, especially for managers that may be more used to the traditional recruiting process?
And you know where the opportunity is really going to exist, Jeff, because you're going to have to do a lot of re-education of hiring managers anyway on how to engage in this new normal or this new student engagement practice. So whereas you might have been able to go to campus directly and talk to a potential candidate in the virtual environment that looks differently. Um, Phone screens have already been kind of used intermediately, but as you're talking to hiring managers already about, hey, here's what this is going to look like this year because of the changes associated with COVID, here's an opportunity now for you to also educate managers on what does equity look like? How do you make sure that you're objective in the decision-making process? How do you make sure that you have representation on your interview panel and the people who are making the decisions about the candidate coming in? So you have the chance to build that into the process and be much more intentional about it as you're already re-educating your managers about the work that needs to happen.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's funny because we see a lot of that also taking place, not just with DEI, but in general,
Mm,
where HR departments are trying to help the manager understand that you don't need a certain GPA or a certain major to do the role. There was a great thread on LinkedIn yesterday about GPA, and one of the things we're seeing more and more human capital leaders doing is using this experiential recruiting approach,
mm,
where they're actually giving managers opportunities to engage with candidates to actually see their work product,
Yeah.
as opposed to just go to this interview or go to this info session. How can you actually, again, show the managers the work product of someone from a different background as part of that retraining?
Yeah. And that's why that losing the internship pool too is going to be so such a detriment for organizations, right? And understanding the why to it. But your interns, they're your known commodities. They've worked with you, you've seen them, they get your business, they spent 1, 2, 3 summers with you, right? So they're
Yeah.
high potential. So to not be able to pull from those known commodities where you're not guessing in 30, 45 minutes or an hour whether or not this person can spend the next 10 years with your company, that becomes it's an obstacle that we'll
Well,
have.
I mean, you know my feelings about that. How do we create more of those internship experiences, whether they're 10 weeks or shorter?
Yeah.
Violently agree with you. But you were also talking before about getting the students to engage and having thoughtful content out there to introduce the students to Aramark.
Yeah.
I guess one of the questions I have is how are you doing it? And maybe it's because I'm cynical or I view so much of the content as being commoditized. How do you do it? Like, what are you offering them to get them in the door to understand what Aramark is?
Yeah. And it's funny, I was just talking to our campus recruiting team about this earlier this week, and we were sort of talking about our professional development strategy. And I think there's a handful of organizations that have the brand recognition that just can place their name on it and they will come, right? Like if I do it, students will be there. And there's a handful of companies who have that type of reputation, and it varies campus to campus accordingly. But I think if you're not in that handful of companies who your brand will automatically mean overflow, you need to be intentional about not just talking about yourself. And generally students they're spoken at a lot, from my opinion. And when you come to campus and just say, look how great we are, come listen to us talk about how great we are for the next hour, it's just sort of it's not something that's interesting. So how do you develop content around things that are really relevant and supplemental to the opportunities that they get from career services? So in this client way, talking about what it means to grow your career, have senior leaders speaking to those students about their career opportunities and how they've made it, having Q&A sessions where students can come in and talk about, here's what I'm thinking about, how can Aramark fit into my plan? So you got to be really creative about building content that's relevant so people come for the content, and then they start to associate this sort of high quality development opportunity with your organization now. So when they make that association, they see you as a path to grow and develop and a place to start their career.
But are there tricks to get through the noise? Because I'm still like, I agree with everything you said, but if I'm a student and I'm getting 27 emails from different companies, and there's a question that came up about career fairs, which we'll get to, how do I get through the noise? And then the other part of it is, when you're talking about certain companies where they have the brand recognition that people are going to show up just because of the brand, is that necessarily a good thing? And are some of those companies potentially missing out on students who would be great candidates, but are either intimidated by the brand or have flawed preconceived notions about what that brand means?
Yeah. And I'll answer the first question first, and then the second one. I think in terms of how you get through the noise, you need to be consistent and build relationships on campus. So when it comes from me, Jameel Rush at Aramark, that means nothing to 99% of the students out there. But if it comes from that career services person or that favorite faculty member or that person who is the advisor for that student professional organization, and they reach out and say, hey, I think you should come to this student because it's going to be really meaningful, that hits completely differently. So who are the key individuals that you need to know, connect in with, and engage with on campus that can really help give you direct access to students? And how do you build those relationships authentically, right? So it needs to be a give and take, not just always, I need you to do, but also what are we doing as an employer to support you in your efforts? What are your students really looking for that we can supplement? Who can we talk to who are some of your best talent that might not have opportunities? Can we do things like mock interviews? that'll allow your students to grow. So it's sort of this give and take relationship where you are there as a resource to those key individuals on campus, and then they help you to get through the noise to make sure that you're accessing the right students and the top talent.
I I love that. I love that for a few reasons. First of all, it ties back to your original story, which is the reason you know about Aramark is because there was an ambassador, and the
Exactly.
ambassador was SHRM. It wasn't a career services ambassador, but it was a student slash professional organization that was on campus. Um, and I think that's really, I think that's a great idea. And I think it also ties back again to the webinar from yesterday with how can the schools and the employers collaborate to create more of those opportunities. The second thing you hit on there was when you're talking about mock interviewing, where and you sort of hit it before, and I think I missed it because I'm not the sharpest crayon in the box. But you talked about providing content that adds value to the students and does something like a mock interview create a catalyst for conversation between Jeff, the student, and Jameel, the professional.
Yeah.
And not just, hey, it's Jameel helping me, but and helping me clean up my resume or my interview, but it's actually starting to form, it's catalyst for forming an authentic relationship where Jameel could be a mentor down the road.
Absolutely. And then think about your earlier question around first generation students and trying to make sure that if this is my first ever professional interview, do I want it to go when there's high stakes, right? This is my dream job and it also be my first interview ever. Doing things like that can help remove those barriers that exist for some of our first generation students, for some of our students from marginalized communities that would not have had that type of low risk um, environment where they can work, have mistakes, get feedback, get better, grow, develop, and then be all the more stronger for it when it comes to game time.
So how do you, I mean, we're talking a lot about the campus recruiting aspect, but I know you and I had a conversation, gosh, it was probably about a month ago,
Yeah.
where we talked about getting the diverse talent in the door is one thing, but how do you create an environment that truly is inclusive? And inclusive in every way, shape, and form, including promotion and career development, et cetera. What are some of the things you're seeing as far as integrating the recruiting and the talent of that? Like, are there best practices that you can share for that? Because it is so important, especially in this environment.
Yeah, and one thing that, and that's a big question too. So there's a lot of
We
layers
got
to it.
30 minutes.
Right. Like, all right, then Jeff, that's your last question. I'm just going to go 30 minutes and.
No one wants to hear me. They want to hear you.
Um, So there's two pieces of it, right? Because, and we talk about diversity and inclusion all the time as if they're the same thing, but it's really important to understand that those are two very, very separate topics. There is the diversity of my workforce and the mix of the individuals. And then there's the inclusion piece, which is once they get here, how do we make sure that they have a voice, they have a seat at the table, and they feel like they can be and bring their whole selves to work. And that inclusion piece is critical because just throwing diverse talent into an organization, no matter what level they are, whether that's a direct from campus hire, a senior executive, whoever that is, if I just say like, you're diverse, you're here, go be successful in an organization that doesn't understand how to engage you, they don't understand how to value your unique perspective and where you might be the only one, right? That's a very difficult task. Or a difficult environment for anyone to be successful in. So now once they get here, how do we make sure we have a culture that one is equitable, right? So you have policies and procedures, not just fair and equal, but equitable, where you have policies and procedures that help to ensure the same access for those who are in your diverse talent. So how are you measuring your leadership development programs to make sure that there's representation across them? How are you looking at your talent pipelines and succession planning to make sure that there's representation there? What programs do you have within your organization that get exposure to senior leaders from your diverse communities? Because we know individuals tend to gravitate towards others who are like them. So if your senior leadership isn't diverse, which most Fortune 500 companies don't have great diversity in their uppermost leadership, how do you make sure that they have to be intentional about mentoring and sponsoring? Which is different conversation, sponsoring that diverse talent and that high potential diverse talent within the organization. So, and then what programs do you have that create community as well? Both for those who are within the diverse communities, but also for allies who are saying like, hey, I want to make sure that I'm part of the solution and I understand what needs to happen. So all of those things are like, that's a lot of rapid fire stuff, but I think all of those things need to be part and parcel. And if you're thinking about a diversity strategy without an inclusion strategy, you're going to be wasting your time.
Yeah, and we had a call, gosh, it was probably a couple of months ago, a similar staff campus recruiting with Renetta McCann over at Leo Burnett. And one of the things she said was, and she made sure, she talked about the difference between diversity and inclusion, but also hit a lot on equity and talked a lot about how do we create an environment where managers aren't just sort of doing it because it's the right thing to do, but they're doing it because they recognize that without diversity and without equity, something's missing,
Mm,
something's lost. And how do you create that environment where managers just feel that way?
yeah.
And I don't know the answer.
And I think that it's important that all your managers understand the business impact, right? And understand that we don't value diversity and inclusion in those pieces just because it's the right thing to do. And you don't want to lose that, right? I think that conversation is critical. It's really important, and it needs to be part of the heart work associated
Yeah.
with it of like, I'm doing this because it is the right thing to do. But oh, by the way, there are significant business impacts associated with doing this work well. You see it in revenue outcomes from organizations. You see it in performance outcomes for diverse teams. I should say diverse and inclusive teams versus homogenous teams. You see it in the level of engagement for organizations who have high levels of inclusion and diversity. So making sure that your managers understand that my team will be better if I have better representation on it is a really critical conversation to have, but an uncomfortable one because it's easier for me to hire a bunch of people like me. If I had a bunch of Jameels, I would argue much less, we'd all be on the same page, and I move quicker because everyone thinks the same way. But quicker doesn't necessarily mean better, right? And
Right.
it's about being able to get that diversity of thought, diversity of opinion, diversity of perspective, backgrounds. All of those things add to me coming up with the best solution to a problem.
I'd love to have a bunch of Jameels on my team. I mean, you. I would. I think it would be awesome. Not a bunch of Jeffreys because we would argue with ourselves. That would be scary. Um, but I guess back to the current environment though, are you finding that it's more or less difficult when people are remote, when people aren't in the same physical location? Is it making it easier to drive your diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, more difficult? Not really seeing any change? Has it opened up opportunities or taken some away?
Yeah, I think right now it's probably too soon to tell because everybody's in crisis management mode, right? We're in COVID, which is it's not just a remote workplace strategy. It's like, hey, I'm trying to figure out how do I even get people back to the building and keep them healthy, and whether we need to do it at all, and how's that impacting productivity, and what does that look like? Are we talking long run, short run here? Some companies are really impacted on the revenue side and customer and client base. So it's harder to tell right now because we're at sort of smack dab in the middle of crisis management. I think anecdotally, we know that if we're not intentional about getting exposure for our diverse communities, they can get left behind. So that includes women, people of color, individuals with different sexual orientations. So you have to make sure that you're intentional about creating space for leadership to see and know the value that your diverse team members are bringing to the table. So if this becomes something that's long term, know that within your talent management strategy and your people strategy, part of that needs to be, oh, how are we getting sponsorship or mentorship to individuals deeper or wherever in the organization um, who don't look like the vast majority of our workforce. So how do we make sure that happens, and what are the programs that we put in place? You know, the development things will still happen, Jeffrey. They'll look different. The leadership development programs, um, but if you're not critically aware of the representation across all of those opportunities, the chances are it just won't happen
Yeah.
organically.
Well, and that's the key word,
Mhm.
intentional. You have to be intentional. Um, so one of the questions that came from the audience beforehand was, are there specific strategies that you and our Aramark are using for virtual recruiting that you think are going well or not going well? And are there things that you're seeing that you expect to continue when we come out of the other side of this pandemic?
Yeah. Quick answer is I'll tell you in the fall. Right now
I
we're
want, no, no, your crystal ball's not
yeah.
polished?
I think a lot of things we'll be tapping into the things that a lot of other organizations are tapping into. So we'll use some video interviewing in there. We'll talk to campuses about what things like virtual job fairs look like and virtual career fairs and how do we utilize those. We're looking at all of them. We're looking at ways to organize students and continue to provide really strong professional development activities on campus in the fall. And I think a lot of those things will continue just because we have a large dispersed workforce anyway. And if they go well, it's an opportunity for us to just think differently about our recruitment strategies more broadly. So I anticipate we'll be tapping into all of them. But what we're also being intentional about right now is what are the new success measures, right? Because that changes and what's the new sort of the new guidelines that we're working against. So that's around converting hires, representation in hires, who's coming off of each campuses, and what how many interviews are actually being converted to full time. So all of those things, that baseline will look different moving forward than what it has been in the past in terms of our success measures.
And can you remind me, and I apologize, I don't remember from our prior conversation, what did Aramark do with its internship program this summer? Or what
Yeah,
is it doing this summer?
yeah, we still have a few. We have quite not nearly as many as we typically would have, just because of a lot of our client sites are shut down where we would have interns. So in the locations that are open, we still have a substantial number of interns, and we're going through the program as constructed, which includes a lot of on-the-job experiences, professional development content that we push through them centrally, and we'll be keeping tabs on them and hopefully be able to convert them to full-time hires coming out. Um, and then once the world opens back up and we can actually bring people back to our locations and our sites, where we're hoping to get them back.
No, that's helpful. Um, and then one of the questions that came up in the chat, and we got a lot before, and you alluded to it, virtual career fairs.
Hmm.
What what are you hearing? What are you thinking? And I know, again, your focus isn't career services,
Yeah.
but any perspective?
Yeah, we've used them before though. So even pre-COVID, we've done them across other spaces. We did it for, say, veteran hiring is one that they've tapped into virtual career fairs a lot before. Uh, I I just we always need to be mindful that there's no silver bullet here. It's not like we're
Yeah.
going to say virtual career. I mean, normal career fairs weren't a silver bullet, right? It wasn't like we had normal career fairs and we were just good to go across it. So I think it is an avenue that we will tap into and employers will be tapping into more broadly. I don't know that it is the solve for it, especially if you have students who aren't on campus and who are also working through other equity focused issues. Like virtual career fairs take up a lot of bandwidth when you're trying to use internet. So if you don't have access to really high speed internet, you're at a disadvantage when you're going in and trying to navigate these environments. So you just have to be aware of who are the communities impacted, who do you get access into those within those virtual career fairs, and then what are the other things you're going to be doing to supplement to make sure you still get access to the best talent.
And that's a good segue to another question that came up, which is using, again, the virtual career fairs or in a virtual or remote environment, um, for companies that boast a strong employee culture, how can they convey it effectively in a virtual or remote environment? How are you highlighting the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Aramark, for instance, in a way that I guess shows the authenticity of it beyond just having something on your website or a billboard in Times Square.
Yeah. And you spoke about it earlier too. Those ambassadors are so critical, and people that are relevant to the audience. So if you have already hired from that campus, for instance, being able to send people back to say, hey, you just graduated from here a few years ago. Can you go talk to students about what your experience will look like? So it feels different coming from me versus this person who can say, no, I was literally sitting in your shoes a few years ago, and here are the things that I know you're nervous about, because these are the things I'm nervous about, and here's how this organization really has helped me grow and develop my career. So I think those ambassadors are critical. Those senior leaders, we have executive sponsors that we send to campuses, especially those that we know are their alma maters that they've graduated from, to say like, no, I was here, and it's a longer window typically than what our recent graduates were, but it still resonates to say like, no, I graduated from this university, and here's why I know that I knew that this was the right decision for me career-wise, and here's the things that I think you should be thinking about as you choose the employer. So I think really highlighting success stories, in particular, those success stories that are relevant to the students on campus, goes a long way in that value proposition.
Well, and you talk about the students, and I think about you and I first meeting at that at the UIA event.
Yeah.
And one of the things I loved about it, beyond getting to hang out with you, was that it was one of the few events where the employers, the colleges, and the students were literally, not just figuratively, but literally in the room together.
Absolutely.
And having the conversations about how to create these equitable pathways for everyone. And the schools, for those on the call who don't know UIA, it's a great network of large universities, where one of the challenges has been that companies come to campus, and even if they get a lot of companies, they're only recruiting the same 20 or 30% of the students.
Right.
So how do you create equitable pathways for all of the students? Anyway, so I go off topic a bit, but what are you hearing from the students this year? Are you getting insights, whether it's directly from students who are reaching out to you, just given your connection with the Temple community or in general, or that you're hearing from your colleagues in other parts of the organization? What's on the students' minds?
Yeah. And I think it's important. There are different groups of students right now. So you have students who are currently in undergrad, right? So they were freshmen, sophomore, juniors before, and they're going into their senior years. You have students who are recent graduates as well. So those are individuals who just finished, and then you have students who just graduated from high school and they're going to college for the first time. They're like remarkably strong-willed. I don't know a better way to put it. Like the way that I think back to 2008, right, when the economy crashed, and just kind of how much of a toll that it took on everyone in the workforce and opportunities in all those spaces. These students now, they're extremely creative, and they're thinking about, how do I use this time and how do I best tap into this time to make sure that I'm ready for when things turn around. So a lot of students are just kind of building connections and reaching out and talking to people about what's going on. I think a lot of them are still a little bit in limbo and trying to figure out what does my college experience look like, much less my job search. So still just waiting to hear. And in some ways, they haven't made a decision about how they feel about everything, because they don't know what the future will look like just yet. And then I think some are just kind of waiting it out, right? Saying like, hey, I'm going to be ready on the other side of this. I know at some point employers are going to start hiring again. How do I stay connected in with those employers? How do I stay connected in with the connections that I've made already, and staying intentional about building my network, so that when those opportunities do come back, I'll be top of mind, and I'll be front of mind to get it called back for them.
That's no, it's insightful, because again, what I love about it is it's not it's not a rose-tinted glasses response,
Yeah.
but you're certainly providing a path of optimism for the students. Because look, it's a really crappy year for a whole bunch of folks, including students who've had internships pulled.
Mm-hmm.
or weren't able to finish up the recruiting. I mean, and that's on top of everything else going on in society. But what I love about your answer is you're giving the students a pathway,
Yeah.
giving them opportunities to be proactive and make the best out of a difficult situation. We had a conversation a couple of weeks ago where the first of all, the students this year, or the students who are graduating next year, when employers see a gap on their resume of this summer, and the student who didn't have the rising senior internship, they'll sort of get it.
Yeah.
They'll at least understand they have an excuse, but they're still going to ask, so what did you do with that time?
Mm-hmm.
And the student who says, I sat home and moaned and complained, or I played video games, bad answer. To the student who says, yeah, I took the time to go learn a new skill, or to build relationships, or to reach out and have a cheesesteak with an alum from my university. Like,
Mm-hmm.
they can really use this summer in such a productive, positive way and show what they stand for, and show the grit and motivation. And I think it's inspiring to hear you comment on that.
And listen, if organizations invest a lot to find strong talent, so at the point that they had given you an offer and said, "Hey, we want you to be with our company," and when those offers had to be pulled back, that that obviously it sucks for the student and it's really bad, but it also sucks for the company of like, we did all of this work to find you. We think you're fantastic. We weeded you out of hundreds of candidates, and you were our one. And now we're running the risk of losing that one. So you'll get called back, right? Like when that opportunity comes back, you're going to be the one that they're reaching out to, and hopefully it doesn't take a long time, and you'll have a wealth of those opportunities. But know that you want to stay sharp and stay ready and stay connected for that time.
Yeah. I mean, we're seeing some neat stuff with that. There's an organization where beyond the business loss that you highlighted, there's also this emotional. I mean, the fact that these recruiters and professionals got to know students and again feel like crap that they're not able to offer the opportunity. We're seeing some really interesting approaches to actually bring some of those internships back, maybe not for 10 weeks, 40 hours per, but smaller bite-sized versions. But it also brings up something else. There was a great program launched, I think today, by an organization called Winning Edge, which works with student athletes from diverse backgrounds, because part of what they've always faced are challenges getting in the door at companies, because sometimes their GPA is not as high, or they don't have time to do those summer jobs or those part-time jobs just because of the requirements of being a full-time student and a student athlete. Where do student athletes fit into Aramark's thought process?
Yeah. And I don't know that we have, we're not as good as that program there where they have a specific target towards student athletes. But I think especially, well, think about the work that we do, right? So we do food service, yes, but think about where we do it. We do it on college campuses. We do it at sports venues and arenas, those places. So for a lot of students who are passionate about that type of work, especially on the sports side, we have a business that it looks different than, you're not going to be playing for the Yankees or the Sixers or the Phillies or something like that, but you'll still be in that space and you're kind of be in that environment. So, I think understanding that there's still careers in sports that aren't in sports is really critical. And that's a lot of the conversation that we have a lot of times.
Well, Winning Edge is a nonprofit that's facilitating it, but I will make sure Aramark is introduced because you should be part of their program to give
Awesome.
those opportunities. And by the way, I love that the Philly guy talked about the Yankees. Thank you.
You saw it pull back, right?
Thank you. You didn't say the Giants. I guess since we're hitting close to the end of the time, what are some of the innovations that are on your plate, whether it's around campus recruiting or diversity and inclusion or whatever? What are some of the things that you're just most excited about coming out of Aramark right now and most excited that are taking place during, again, this really crappy environment?
Yeah, I think right now for us and like many organizations and people across our nation, we're sort of hyper focused on the social unrest that's going on in our communities and how are we responding. And terrible reason, and it sucks that sort of these people have had to lose their lives for organizations to get focused on this. But I think companies are focusing in a completely different way around what does equity look like, specifically as it relates to racial inequity and injustice, and how are we making sure that people of color and Blacks and African Americans in specific get access to opportunities within our organization. So what are we doing to serve those communities, and what are we doing to give voice to make sure that we are not enabling systemic racism, but that we're helping to disband and play an active role in dismantling it. So that's been some of my most exciting conversations over the last few weeks, of saying, what are we doing to support our Black and African American employees? The number of allies that have stepped up and said, like, hey, I'm here, I'm ready to be a part of the solution. So you tell me what I do. So we had literally like hundreds to a couple of thousand of our managers who had just stood up and said, like, I need to learn what it means to be an anti-racist. I need to know what it means to dismantle systemic racism. I'm going to spend my time learning about it, and I'm going to make a commitment to be an ally for it. So that's been really, really exciting to see the workplace and the workforce mobilize around being part of this solution, and to see the number of people who are making those long-term commitments to say, what do I need to do individually within my teams? How do I create space for diversity and inclusion within my groups? What are the cultural barriers that we need to be able to work against within Aramark, outside of Aramark? Who are the partners that we need to have? So there's a lot of energy in this space right now, and it's really exciting. And I am super optimistic that it's going to lead to long-term tangible change, right? And if I wasn't optimistic, it'd be a sucky job to be in. But but I'm very optimistic about what this means for our company.
You're making me feel inspired. I mean, I mean, like, you're the way you're looking at what's a horrible situation, and sort of taking a glass half full approach, I think is really inspiring. And I think it's something that we all need right now. You're also bringing up some great points. Again, the check the box diversity no longer cuts it.
Correct.
You can't just put up a billboard and say whatever message and expect that to be enough. People will see through it, as we're seeing. But have we actually created, or has this horrible situation created an environment that can no longer be swept under the metaphorical rug?
Yeah.
I mean, is there so much pain and so much turmoil that it just needs to be addressed, and there's no way out?
Absolutely. People are holding their companies accountable in a whole different way, right? Consumers are holding the organizations that they patronize accountable in a whole different way. So when accountability boards and investors, right, like all of those things, all of those different stakeholders are asking those questions. So when you get all of those accountability partners in place, that's how you drive change, because no one's going to let you kind of put out the words. And we saw that from companies, the statements from CEOs and organizations and all that stuff, super inspirational, right thing to do. But I think what we see now is the pivot to, all right, here's what we're going to do about it, right? So I'm glad that we made those statements, but here's how we're actually going to make sure that we're a part of the solution.
But how do we make sure it doesn't stop? I mean, and nothing against Silicon Valley, but there was an article a couple of weeks ago talking about how Silicon Valley's talked about the desire to drive diversity, equity, and inclusion for 5 years. And if you look at the numbers, just ain't getting where it needs to. Yeah. How do we make sure this doesn't stop when people return to the workforce, and when or return to the workplace, and when the wood panels come off the windows of the store? How do we make sure we don't forget and we don't lose this momentum?
Yeah, and I think it's individual, right? It needs to be more than the diversity office talking about diversity and inclusion, right? So each of us individually has a role to play inside of this work. So each of us individually can be asking our leaders the question of, hey, what's the representation looking like within our team? Have you taken a temperature of the current cultural climate, and is it one that's inclusive? Are there policies, procedures that we need to be changing and updating to ensure equitable practices? Hey, walked into this room and there was literally no diversity on this team that I'm working in. That probably doesn't make sense. How can we make sure that we expand the reach to make sure there's more representation within communities? How do we change our selection process to make sure that's not happening? So when we individually start to hold organizations accountable and hold ourselves accountable, that's how it remains consistent. When you put it on someone else to do it for you, then it's hard, right? Because we're
But
hoping that someone else keeps the steam.
I love the way you just brought it all full circle, which is while you may be sort of head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Aramark, it's not a department that can exist in the vacuum. It's one
Exactly.
that needs to be infused and integrated throughout the entire organization. And it's creating these opportunities for the employers to not just do it because it's the right thing to do, and they should appreciate it as, but also show them why they should do it and what's missing if they're not being inclusive.
Mhm. And how do we normalize these conversations too? I think a lot of people want to be allies, and they, in their heart of hearts, sort of want to be in that space, but it's so foreign to them that they're afraid to say the wrong thing, so they say nothing. So how do we normalize this conversation around equity, inclusion, around racism, all of these things that we're talking about right now, and to say, you need to talk about it. You'll get better over time the more you learn, the more you engage with individuals in this conversation. You'll become more fluent in the language. But if you say nothing, if you're not practicing, there's no way to get better.
Well, thank you so much. We're hitting the top of the hour. Jameel, I always love talking to you.
It's always a
This
pleasure.
was great. Your insights were incredible. It was a little bit different of a take than we normally do for the campus recruiting, where it's just so focused on the tactical sort of best practices. I love that this time there was such a focus on this important issue. So thanks so much for sharing your perspective and your experiences. I will definitely make sure to connect you with the Winning Edge folks.
Great.
Their work is just incredible. So we'll make sure we're getting you some more student athletes.
Perfect.
But thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for the great questions. For those we weren't able to answer along the way, please let us know, and we'll try to follow up more directly. And with that, this concludes the webinar. Thanks again.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everyone.